and I'm with the Office of Financial Aid. I just want to thank Dr. Brammer. He also prefers to go by Ephraim, so you can like call him by his first name, not Dr. Brammer. He also wants you all to hopefully, if you're able to, if it's accessible, for you to keep your cameras on. But if not, no, we completely understand. COVID's right now happening, and a lot of things are going on at home, whether it's kids or other responsibilities. So we understand if you're not able to turn your camera on, that's fine. So before we get started, I just want to give acknowledgement to Ethereum, all the people who organized this event, our ancestors, for each people that might be here today, as well as the land that we reside on. So I wore green today for the land. So in the African flag, green is the color of the land. So the land that we reside on is Native American land. Whether you're in Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, wherever you may be in the United States, this is Native American land that we're residing on. So I put in the DEI safe space rules as well. So if you want to go over those, I can go through them as well with you all. So this is a safe space or a brave space. I like to call it a brave space instead, because sometimes we have to get over our fears, and being uncomfortable is okay. Being able to talk about tough topics is necessary to grow, right? As an organization, as individuals. So I think it's important for us to kind of break through those barriers that we might have in ourselves and learn from each other. So what is a safe space or a brave space? It's a place where anyone can relax and be fully self-expressed and be themselves without fear of being made to feel uncomfortable, unwelcomed, or challenged on account of biological sex, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or sexual expression, gender identity or expression, cultural background, political affiliation, religion, or any other demographic group or social identity. In a safe space is a positive, affirming psychological and emotional environment which encourages the kind of open and honest communication that's necessary and allows participants to be themselves. So we should be able to show up in this space and be able to be ourselves the best that we can each and every day. So some of the guiding principles are equalizing the space. So confidentiality, although this event is recorded, the breakout sessions will not be recorded. Those are for confidentiality purposes. So if you all can be free to express yourselves in the breakout rooms. So share stories, experiences that you might have, not names and gossip. Give space before you take space in the discussion. So sometimes it's okay to step back and take a step back to allow others to voice their opinions, their experiences. Value and encourage risk taking while maintaining everyone's right to pass if they don't want to talk about a certain topic. Challenge the idea or the thought, but not the person. So you don't want to attack people, but attack maybe the idea or where it's coming from and the ideology behind it. Remember, the knowledge and opinions are equally valid. So your experience is your experience and it's valid to you and it's valid to everyone else because that's what you went through. Check your assumptions at the door or in the virtual Zoom or before you came here. No judgment or disclaimers, including self-judgments. Treat everyone the way you want to be treated. Personalize your knowledge, don't project it. Use I statements. Believe we all have the best intentions. And then you also have the right to be human. So last week, December 10th, was National Human Rights Month, or this is actually National Human Rights Month this month, but last week, December 10th, was National Human Rights Day. So you all have the right to be human as well. We all have the right to be human and consistent, emotional, and triggered, and we all make mistakes, and that's okay. Avoid blaming people for misinformation, talk to them, and acknowledge your own emotions and practice forgiveness and grace. And then last but not least, practice consensual dialogue, active listening, attention focused, maintain appropriate eye contact if you can via Zoom, check your body language, and take breaks only when necessary. And silence is okay. Sometimes you learn the most when we're silent and we don't talk, right? Because sometimes you're able to observe and learn and absorb information that you may be receiving during the silence. An unforced pace or dialogue prompts safe engagement. So it's okay to be silent if you don't have anything to say or don't have anything positive to bring to the conversation. It's okay to be silent. We also want to give space and voice to people who haven't traditionally been heard in these conversations as well. So next will be Phil's going to show a brief video, about a 5-minute video he's going to show. It's a TED Talk that we found very interesting and had a lot of insights into it. So we're going to show that and then do a quick breakout session afterwards around the video in which you may have had a chance to read before this event.
I create things for a living. I would say I'm primarily a painter. I work in mixed media and paint and creating work that's very much about Indigenous identity, historical consideration, decolonization. But I'm also creating murals. This is actually a CU Boulder. I just finished it, and you'll notice it's in the school colors. But I'm also mostly known for performance art. I create work that is about being in spaces that are not normally spaces that people think we occupy. I tackle things like stereotype and conceptions and misconceptions. It's everything from concepts of standing rock to even things like blood quantum, the way in which we are quantified through an American process that decides how much Indian we are and whether or not we're Indian enough to matter. There's two main tools of everything that I do, and it has brought me to this stage. I do a lot with history and historical consideration, and I also do a lot of critical thinking. And within those things, I've discovered something, and that is that the value of Indigenous people is really low in the eyes of America and in the eyes of American culture. That there's a hierarchy that is set within those spaces that immediately tells every child and ultimately every adult that is having education here in the United States what our value is. So for example, we know who Christopher Columbus is, but we don't know the name of the people that he came into contact with. I mean, I know, you guys might not know. But that's important because it already tells you he's important and we are not. In fact, it goes so deep that he came here and he thought he was in India, and so he called the people he came into contact with, which was actually the modern day Dominican Republic, he called them Indians, and 500 plus years later, we all know that he was lost at sea, but we still call Indigenous people Indians. Abraham Lincoln has this incredible legacy in history. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But what you don't know is he also, the week before the Emancipation Proclamation was to be enacted, he signed off on the largest mass hanging in American history. 38 Dakota men who were being hung for little more than just to make an example of them. It happened on the 26th, so it was the day after Christmas. I'm not saying this to make a divisive statement about Abraham Lincoln. I'm telling you this because when we omit things from history, then we immediately give value to those things. And what this does is this sets us up with something that is really damaging. When we think of Indians, we think of things like this. When I was a kid, there was these Looney Tune cartoons that were pretty popular. And you know, people could look at this and they think it's no big deal. It's just a cartoon. It's satire. It's funny. But here's what happens. Young children see this. Native children see this. And it immediately tells them what the world thinks of them. That they are a caricature. They are not to be taken seriously. But further than that, it tells your children what our value is. And it informs your children what we look like, what we talk like, what we act like, and all of it is pigeonholed into one single thing, which is this. And so we see things like this. Pocahontas, she was actually 10 years old when she went through the things that she went through. And these images are burned into the American psyche. They're burned into American culture. They're burned into Western culture. And so they manifest themselves at things like Coachella and Burning Man. And next thing you know, we have sports mascots that are somehow representing every Native person in the land. There's over 567 tribes that are federally recognized in the United States. There's several hundred more that are not recognized, that are usually recognized by the state. There's over 300 different languages. This is just in the United States. This doesn't count Canada or Central America or South America. And yet, we're supposed to accept these things as an honor. In fact, these people have no context to what we are and who we are, so much so that they believe that they're not just honoring us, but that they are carrying our legacy. So this brings me to my work. As an artist, I've found that the only way to function as an artist is that you have to work within the bounds of what Western culture expects you to do. They expect us to be painting cowboys and Indians. People are heading down to Santa Fe and they want to buy a nice Indian painting by a nice Indian to put in their home because it's Indian. And as a result of that, we're one of the few subcultures in the art world that is actually being controlled by a Western buyer's market that decides whether or not there's value with our stories. And it's a risk. I mean, if I do anything different than that, it is an inherently professional risk. So I've decided to take a professional risk. I'm working under the premise of what does contemporary Indigenous art look like when it is not informed by a Western buyer's market. So the first piece I created for that is this piece. It is a self-portrait. I was in kindergarten, and it's a seemingly innocent image, but it's titled Prairie Nigger, because that's what the kids called me when I was a kid. I went to an all-white school. I was the brownest kid that was in school, and that is what they called me. And I don't say that to be decisive or blasé about a word, but to illustrate the intersectionality that exists within the language of racism and intolerance. And this is how I experienced it at the age of 5 or 6 years old. And this is not a unique story for Indigenous children. This is happening all over the country. And the reason for that is because nobody has any context to who or what a Native person is. There is no value to our stories. In fact, this piece has been rejected from 2 shows, one of which they asked me to bring the piece, and 2 days later said, we can't hang this because of the word that's there, for a Native voice group show. So you can see there's not even space for our stories, the stories that don't make sense, the stories that don't fall in line with that cowboy and Indian narrative.
Just as an FYI, you listen to the rest of the piece if you can. He's first of all very funny at the beginning of introducing his kids, but also talks, the next piece is also about boarding schools that happened during the mid-century. So if you get a chance, please watch the rest of the video. He's very engaging and very, very heartfelt.
Yeah, because we didn't want to steal Dr. Ephraim's thunder with that, so let's stop there. Yep. We're going to do a quick breakout session. I think we have groups of about 5 or 6 people in breakout rooms. I'll give you a couple questions. So the first question I thought about is, the talk was about, what do people know about Native Americans, right? The educational system. What are we taught when we're growing up either at home or in school about Native Americans in the United States of America? So that's my first question. What have you learned, or what were you taught about Native Americans, whether it's in school, at home, whatever your learning environment might have been? What did you learn, or what didn't you learn about Native Americans? And then my second question is about images. So we know Clements, they just acquired a collection of Native American photography collection. How do those images differ or similar to the images shown by Greg Dill in that TED Talk? How are those images similar or different to those? How are they curated? How are they presented to the public?
Okay, should I start the breakout room now, Antonio?
Yes, please. And I'll put those questions in the chat as well if you need a reminder about those questions. Okay, so everyone should be back in the main room now. Hopefully you all had great discussion about Native American communities and the representation of Native Americans, whether through media, through art, or representation on campus. So next we're gonna do, you don't have to share your information, that's confidential, as the meeting is being recorded still, so you can keep that information confidential. But next we're gonna have Ephraim or Dr. Brammer present more so about Native American community and fulfilling the promise that U of M made in the Fort Meigs Treaty. Well, I want to welcome Ephraim Brammer. He is a great resource. I met him actually last year at Rackham, but he's an assistant dean and DEI implementation lead over at the Rackham Graduate School. He's a great resource. So we thought in OEM that we probably shouldn't talk about this topic when we're not experts on the subject matter. So we just reach out to somebody who is an expert and has an authentic and accurate information about the Native American community here at U of M as well as at large. So go ahead and pass it over to Ephraim Brammer to do his presentation. And I'll go through the slide if you all need any have any questions. He does have breaks within the presentation too if you have any questions for him. That you feel free to unmute your mic or go in the chat and add your question to there.
So thank you so much. I appreciate all of you being here, especially this close to the holiday, to engage in this kind of learning. I want to express my thanks to Antonio and Ted and Phil, especially individually, for creating this space and inviting me into it. My name is Ethan Brammer. I use he, him pronouns for full inclusion, accessibility. I wear glasses. I'm currently wearing a gray sport coat and black shirt, and I usually wear my hair in a braid. And so just very, very excited to be here and to be able to talk about this. I'm grateful for the opportunity actually to reflect on the progress over the last year and a half. And so this has given me the opportunity to sort of take inventory, take stock of the great work that has sort of emerged from the Native American Student Task Committee and those recommendations. And I'll get to talk about that in a second. But since we're starting with the discussion of land acknowledgement, maybe we can go to the land acknowledgement right now. The next slide, please. So territorial acknowledgement, we've still been working on this. As you'll see in the presentation, it was the #1 recommendation coming out of the task committee, and I'll explain why in a second. But the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan, ceded through the Treaty of Fort Meigs so that their children could be educated. And we'll talk about all of that. We recognize the history of displacement of Native communities that facilitated the founding of the University of Michigan. We acknowledge the sovereignty of tribal lands, and we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land, as well as the profound contributions of Native Americans to this institution. Just released this morning was the report on the President's Commission on carbon neutrality, and this was the version that they used. So I'm really appreciative of those who worked on this. In particular, Dilip Das, who's also on this call and co-chaired the task committee that I'll be referring to. And so the purpose for today's workshop, as I understand it, is to explore the historical objectives and educational access. If you want to move the slide, please. To explore the historical obstacles to educational access and attainment for Native Americans broadly. So we'll talk about just the broad context. To better understand the historical challenges to educational access and attainment for Native Americans at Michigan in particular. There's some particular nuances, even in the territorial acknowledgement, when you uncode that. We're starting to see, this is a trend to do territorial acknowledgements in public universities or all universities in the country, but throughout North America and even in countries like New Zealand, Australia. But the University of Michigan is distinct in that we actually had the treaty, right? So it goes beyond just being on land of Native people, which is true of all of these universities, but we actually engaged with Native peoples to help found and create the university. And that it is different, right? In terms of whether or not we're fulfilling the promises that we set out at the genesis of the university. And so we also want to become more familiar with current resources, want to learn more about current efforts to improve. So there is continuous improvement. I talked about the task committee, and then examples of possible OEM initiatives. I'm grateful to you all in particular, because I think you all have a space in forwarding Native student success on campus. Like you all as a team collectively can do important work to help support Native students. And so we'll talk about some things that are possible to consider. So I'm going to start with the historical obstacles. And again, this is broadly, it's important to remember, I'll talk, often about Turtle Island, which is more of an indigenous understanding of what we call North and South America right now. It's important to name and remind people that the current geopolitical borders did not exist for Native peoples before colonization and before U.S. expansion. And so some of these issues are not even unique to the United States, right? So you'll see some of these obstacles are the same obstacles that First Nations people face in Canada, for example, or what is now Canada. And also, I think it's worth pointing out that I'm Purepecha, which is an indigenous group of Mexico, right? And so I'm not Anishinaabe. So I'm just as much of a guest on Anishinaabeg land as anyone else, right? Even though I'm an indigenous person of North America. And so, but a lot of these trends you'll find in other countries, unfortunately, as well. And so, one thing that's a predominant narrative, and it's borne out by statistics, right, is that Native American people in what is now the United States have the lowest degree of educational attainment as measured by bachelor's degree completion, right? And so it has the biggest gap. And so with other marginalized and minoritized communities like African Americans and members of the Latinx community, there is a substantial gap, but Native Americans have the largest gap. And so reading these numbers just on the face without context becomes really, really problematic, right? So what ends up happening is it feeds into deficit discourses, especially if you imagine these numbers as within the context of the framing of a meritocracy that would have people believe or accept that all things are equal, right? So that everyone has exactly the same and equal opportunity for education historically as well as contemporarily. And so then the question becomes, why aren't Native American students achieving? Right. And I really want to unpack those deficit discourses and give some historical context. And so, if we look at this in real numbers, that 22% translates into over 33 million non-white, non-Hispanic whites that have degrees where only 500,000 Native Americans. And then because I'm at the graduate school, I decided to throw graduate school attainment in there as well. And so similarly, the biggest gap exists, almost a twofold gap between non-Hispanic whites and natives. And what that represents is a gap of over almost 15 million people. Right, so there's almost 15 million non-Hispanic whites more that have advanced degrees than Native, and so there's fewer than 100,000 Native American people in our country right now with advanced degrees. I'm sure you all have better data than I do, but one of the issues, and I'll recommend, beyond the asterisks at the end of my presentation, the numbers are so small, the N is so small that it's hard to even track the trends, right? Or reliable trends. And so when we look at real numbers and you see a decline from 2010 to 2018 from 11 FIDIACs to 3 in the next slide, that shows a decline. A decline of 8 students in any other population would be nominal, right? But when you're talking about a community that's so small already, it's substantial. And so it's an area where we need to do a lot of work, and it's an area where it's hard to tell given the small N, but it feels like we're losing ground, right? So we needed to do better before. And over the last 10 years, if anything, it's shown that we really continue to need to do better because things are kind of at a crisis point. And that's true for graduate education as well. And so, again, it's hard to really talk about trends when the ends are so small, but we do seem to be going in the wrong direction with Native American students at the graduate level, which is the next slide. As well. And so Again, looking at the overall picture of Native Americans having the lowest educational attainment, taken on its face, you know, would suggest like what's going on with Native students? Why aren't Native students achieving? Next slide. And so what I wanted to do was give a little bit of a timeline to provide context. Next slide, please. Again, the meritocracy and looking at that data as if all populations have equal access to education really ignores and erases the sort of systematic racism that exists, right? And so all things are not equal. European contact in North America, and I was really glad to see the speaker in the TED Talk point out that Columbus really didn't come to what is now the United States, which doesn't really get explored very much in U.S. schools, right? I had to go to college before I think I was really taught intentionally, that Columbus didn't actually come to what is now the United States, but to the Caribbean. So in 1492, contact between Europeans and at that time Caribbean people. We have the first, what we might describe as access to public education for the English colonies in 1635. So the United States doesn't even really exist yet. And as you can imagine, during that time, those who went to these kinds of forms of public education were young boys, right, in the English colonies. And so they're being educated in very intentional ways. There's 150 years before young girls get admitted to similar kinds of schools. And so I want to call out, right, the gender inequities as well. But even 30 years after young girls get admitted to school, not only are there not schools for natives, but like African Americans at this time in the 1800s, literacy is punishable by death in some areas, right? So you're not allowed to read. And if somebody discovers that you read, it can have very painful consequences. And so African Americans, Native Americans, actually have this active sort of attack on their ability to access any formal education. And the Indian Removal Act is put into place, which means they're actively being dislocated from their lands, right? And so, you have U.S. expansion in 1848. That expansion includes more displacement of indigenous Mexican people. The first government Indian schools, and this is where I'm going to spend a lot of my time, was in 1879. So just that, between 1635 and 1879, is more than a 200-year head start that some populations have over Native American populations in this country in terms of formal schooling, right? But we want to talk about what those actual schools looked like, because they still don't have the same objectives in mind, right? So there might be schools, but their pedagogical practices and the purposes, the mission for those schools are not the same. And so if we can go to the next slide. 1879, remember, is when these Indian schools are being built, and one of the most well-known cases is that of Carlisle, the U.S. Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where the explicit purpose, right? Like this was their motto. This was their sort of mission as a school, was to kill the Indian and save the man. So, young people were being taken from their families. They were being taken from their communities. They were being forcibly removed. Their hair was being cut, which was a metaphor for everything else that they were being cut away from. They were being cut away from their language. They were being cut away from their spiritual practices, cut away from their families, their traditions, their songs, their music. And that was actually the mission of the school, right? So that was thought as, the purpose for it. And, Pennsylvania is pretty close, but even closer to home is Mount Pleasant. So the next slide, please. So the Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial Boarding School followed the same model, right? And so there were a number of these boarding schools in the state of Michigan. And so the Mount Pleasant School operated until 1934. And so again, even though those schools existed, they did not exist in the same way. So there was a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, sort of built into the system. And the purpose was to forcibly assimilate a structure, or framework that we can use to talk about this is subtractive education. Right. So normally we think of education as additive, right? So it's supposed to improve on your skills. It's supposed to build your knowledge. And so subtractive is doing the opposite, right? So these schools weren't constructed to teach Native children how to read and write and kind of enter any kind of profession. Its only purpose was to stop them from speaking their language, stop them from practicing their culture, their forms of spirituality, and separate them from their family and their community's traditions. And so the operant model of schooling for acculturated US-born youth structurally deprives them of social capital. So it wasn't additive. It wasn't to build social capital. It was actually to break down any social capital that they might have that would otherwise enjoy were the school not so aggressively subtractively assimilationist. So these schools were meant to be assimilationist. And so in 1972, we get the American Education Act. It's interesting that in 1972, that's post Westminster, that's post Brown versus School Board, that's post the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act, because all of those advances, yeah, absolutely, cultural genocide was the purpose, right? It was accepted express purpose of the schools. And so even after Brown versus School Board and ESA, there were still gaps in the way that Native students were being educated, right? And so Congress in 1969 did a study. The title, right, from the Senate was Indian Education, a National Tragedy. Right. So even with everything going on with Brown and ESA, there's this recognition that there was something even more acute going on with Native communities. And so it's really important to note that the last boarding school in Michigan, if we can go to the next slide, in Traverse City, in Harbor Springs, that was fully functional and operating, was operating all the way to 1983 under the same educational model. And so this is not ancient history, right? We're not talking about 1492. And so the damage and the historical trauma, we have young people whose parents experience these schools, right? And so all of the mistrust of formal schooling in the United States, it's tangible, right? They talk to their parents, they talk to their grandparents, and these are the fears and the anxieties that they have when they're approaching U.S. educational institutions. And so that's really, really important to know. I'm just looking at the time, and maybe if we can hold off on questions, I'm going to speed through a couple of these sections first. So this is true throughout North America, right? So these historical traumas that I'm describing, these obstacles throughout North America, because it was a common practice, right? These practices of colonization were shared across what are now our political borders. And so if you're interested in learning more, there's a great resource from the Zibwayne Center, which is in Mount Pleasant. And so they do a really good job of sort of providing Indigenous perspectives, Anishinaabe perspectives on the trauma and the harm that was caused by these schools in the state of Michigan. So there's both, a book reference as well as a website that was put together by the Saginaw Chippewa tribe. And so this is all true. This is again a phenomenon that that unfortunately took place throughout Turtle Island, but the University of Michigan also has its own challenges with its relationship with Native American people, because like I said before, when we were discussing the territorial acknowledgement, the University of Michigan is unique in that part of its founding intersects with an actual treaty with Native peoples. And so the University of Michigan, states that its founding was in 1817, and that's because of the signing of the Treaty of Fort Meigs. Article 16 is really interesting. So historically, as the United States continued to expand beyond the 13 original colonies, these treaties were being signed, and Native peoples that were further to the west got to see what their relatives to the east were experiencing when they didn't sign or they didn't cooperate. And so the threat of violence was very real. I do not want to minimize the anxiety, the coercion historically that took place. I do want to hold up, though, the Anishinaabe ancestors who knew that they were not in a good negotiating position, but used whatever negotiating position they had to say, well, if we're going to do this, if we're going to sign, we're going to try to get something out of it for our children. And so this is very consistent with Indigenous ways of philosophy of, you look 7 generations behind you to your ancestors and the models that they've taught you, but you also make decisions for 7 generations ahead of you. And so I think, the Anishinaabe ancestors were definitely sort of living out those values, and they tried to negotiate for 7 generations of children to come after, right? Because Article 16 is expressly about giving the land in exchange for at least some opportunity for their children to be educated in that institution, right? And what that institution became was the College at Detroit, which eventually would become the University of Michigan. And so, again, we have a very special relationship. Unfortunately, next slide, that promise at the signing of the treaty, like so many treaties in our country, really went unfulfilled. And I think OEM has an opportunity, and University of Michigan in general has an opportunity to really begin to repair some of that harm. Some of the best estimates believe that it took 130 years before the University of Michigan enrolled its first Native American student. We can't find an accurate record, but that's the best guess. There was a lawsuit that was filed in 1971 based on the Treaty of Fort Meigs in Article 16 that the state should be compelled to grant free tuition to American Indians. The state Supreme Court decided that that was not their legal obligation, vis-a-vis the treaty. However, because of this sort of ethical and moral obligation, there was the creation of the Michigan Indian Tuition Waiver in 1976. And so that was kind of the remedy, but the remedy is very complicated and difficult to access, and we can talk about that later. And so other sort of pain points or sources of historical trauma and distrust of specifically the University of Michigan is that the University of Michigan Museum of Anthropology held more than 1,300 Native American human remains. So the actual physical bones of ancestors, that's one of the largest collections of Native remains in the country before NAGPRA compliance. And so you can imagine, the difficulty, right? And the pain that is caused to the local Native population, knowing that their ancestors are, put on display in museums and held in collection. And the University of Michigan was out of compliance, frankly, for more than 15 years of NAGPRA. So this is an area where I think we've grown a lot. And so now the University of Michigan is a model for good NAGPRA stewardship and compliance, but it wasn't always that way, right? But this is an example of how we can take some unfortunate parts of our history and actually show leadership and become a national model for how to do things well. Another really important source of pain for the local Native population and community is Michigan. So it was established in 1902, and like the artist showed, right, there was the same kind of perpetuation of appropriated imaging. Unfortunately, U of M leadership was among the membership of Michigan. So they did pseudo-native ceremonies that appropriated the sacred objects, of which they had many, right, in the museums. And there was a practice of wearing red face. They're also granted exclusive access to the tower in the Michigan Union. And so when students found out about this, there were a number of protests. And so as a result, they don't have the access to the tower anymore. They changed their name. There's still, some distrust about whether this group still exists and who's participating. And so, again, just like the boarding schools, these are not sort of parts of Michigan's ancient history. These are very alive in sort of the collective memory of Native peoples that interact with the University of Michigan. And so those contribute to a set of very particular obstacles when we're engaging with our Native communities, right? They will bring this up, and they will, reasonably want to see what progress is being made. They will want to see some accountability around, like, how do we heal these historical wounds and scars, and how do we begin to rebuild trust and faith? And so, again, those that are doing recruitment, those that are doing community engagement should be aware of that, right? Because it's very much a part of the discourse. So what can we do to improve, right? So again, NAGPRA is a great story of how we improved. When we took these issues seriously and we invested and we wanted to do the right thing, we can do much better. And so opportunities for improvement, in October of 2018, Chief Diversity Officer Robert Sellers convened a group called the Native American Student Task Committee. It was co-chaired by faculty member Robert Mengenson, as well as Dilip Das. And later the following year, and in October is when the actual report was released. So earlier that year, we began working on it, and then October 15th is when the report was released, and there are a number of recommendations. So we identified a lot of different ways that the University of Michigan could heal these wounds, fulfill some of their promises, and work better with the Native community on our campus, around our campus, as well as with our new and prospective students. And so next slide is recommendations. There are 10 recommendations. They're split into sub recommendations as well, but around 3 principal themes in Anishinaabe. So Minadena Mwen basically translates Moen is language, Mina is good. So good ways of speaking. So speaking respectfully and acknowledging. Gashkewizi, student success. So it's success, accomplishment. Dibandagozi, sense of place and or belonging. So your location, your place, your connection to the land. And so again, going through quickly, just for the sake of time, you will have access to these slides to go through more slowly. It was interesting that in the conversation, the consensus among the task committee was that students, staff, and faculty could never truly feel a sense of belonging on our campus without the basic acknowledgement of the history of the land upon which the University of Michigan resides, as well as the historical relationship between the University of Michigan and regional Native American communities. So if we didn't tell the story of Fort Meigs, like none of this will ever be sufficient, right? Especially to the Anishinaabe community. We needed to tell the story of the treaty. We needed to demonstrate how their ceding of the land made the University of Michigan possible and made it what it is today. And so that is translated as the institutionalizing of the practice of territorial acknowledgement, right? And so, but that was just the first recommendation. And many universities, are being held to account because that's kind of all they're doing, right? And we definitely did not want to be that kind of campus. And so we do need to tell the story of Fort Meigs. We do need to acknowledge the contributions of Anishinaabe, other Native American and Indigenous people, but we need to go much further beyond that. And so if you can skip a couple slides, to student success. The success of all University of Michigan students is the utmost importance. However, culturally and linguistically responsive practices are critical to the success of Native students, right? And so, again, there are a lot of shared experiences of oppression with African-American people, Latinx people, and other marginalized people in our country. But we explored some of the unique differences, right, with Native people. And so I'm highlighting the enhancing of Native American student recruitment, retention, and achievement, because this is something that we could really use the help of Office of Enrollment Management with, right? But there were other recommendations in this area as well, including hiring a Native American support specialist, establishing an elder in residence program, recruiting and hiring Native faculty, and then strengthening Native American studies as a curricular program. The areas in student success, the next slide, where OEM I think could have the most impact is in expanding outreach and collaboration across campus. For Native American Heritage Month, MESA does a great job with that. I think OEM does have a place, right, in supporting that work as well. Developing an orientation program or retreat for incoming Native American students, so a bridge program for our incoming students to start building cohort and sense of belonging and community right from the beginning. Consulting with tribal educational leadership to conduct outreach efforts designed for middle school and high school students. If anything, those graphs show, in addition to having, issues of undergraduate and graduate enrollment, it's a pipeline issue as well. And so we can't address, where we fit in the academic trajectory without starting to think comprehensively about the K through 12 needs of the Native community. Right. And one way that we used to do it was with Camp Kinamage. And so, thinking about bringing something like Camp Kinamage back, or maybe an improved model would be great. And we've even talked about doing something like this at the biostation up north, bringing actually the programming to where the largest critical mass of Native population is, especially the reservation communities in the Upper Peninsula. And so similarly, we don't have to recreate the wheel. Wolverine Pathways, great program. We can just expand or become more aware and lift up the needs of Native students for these kinds of strategies, right? And so a Wolverine Pathways for students on reservation communities, for example. Doesn't have to be that, but one idea. So the next slide, extending summer bridge programs. We also have summer bridge programs on our campus already, right? And so integrating Native students or making sure that Native students are intentionally made part of those efforts and have access to those efforts. Collaborating with other local higher educational institutions has kind of been something that I've been working on, in particular because at the graduate school level, we're drawing from many different institutions. It's also a pipeline issue, right? But I don't think that there are any, maybe just a handful of universities in the country that do well, right, with Native American students in their education. And so this is a collective issue and could benefit from a collective response. And so some cooperation across campuses could be really, really helpful. Connecting with college advising corps and making sure that they have a presence in tribal high schools and tribal middle schools as appropriate, and expanding the benefits, and I'll go into this much later, of the Michigan Indian tuition waiver. There are a lot of, and the artist in the TED Talk alluded to this, there are a lot of legislative obstacles and hurdles, which makes the Michigan Indian tuition waiver very difficult to access, even for federally recognized tribal citizens. And so we also talked about sense of place and sense of belonging. Some things are being done there, including the Vicky Barner room, to create a sense of space. And again, I apologize if I'm going too quickly, but just trying to be respectful for people's time. So current resources, I'm really grateful for all the things that we have, right? So next slide, please. I don't want to give the impression that we don't do anything for Native American students, because that's not true. We do have infrastructure. We do have programming in place. We have a lot of dedicated professionals. I know Cheyenne's on this call as well, who are working very hard to support the success of our Native students, and working well, collaborating well with the tribal communities. And so just some of them, the Native American Student Association is critically important. At Rackham, trying to support graduate students as well. They have a connection with NASA. The Native American Studies Program is critical infrastructure for studying Native culture, as is the Anishinaabe language program, which is connected to Native American studies. The preservation of this endangered language is super important, especially when we're talking about healing the historical wounds that were created by these boarding schools, right? Where young people were punished for speaking their native languages, right? And so these boarding schools contributed directly to the destruction, right? And our difficulty with maintaining Anishinaabe as a language. And so we have active chapters of SACNAS and ACES, which is really important. Bob Mengenson, who is the co-chair of this committee, very active with both of those, in particular with ACES. Native American Heritage Month, I hope you had an opportunity to join some of those events this year. They did a phenomenal job, despite COVID, to have a very robust and engaging set of speakers and events. They have Native Grad, the Vicky Barner room that I talked about, which is in housing. I believe we've already mentioned the Clements Library new collection. These are ways that we can heal, right? A really important project in Mathai is the Heritage Siege Project. And so this is similar to returning ancestors, right? So returning grandmothers that are seeds, right? So the indigenous plants and different forms of life from this land and returning them to the ground, right, is really, really important. And I'm grateful for the work that they do at Mathai for that. I kind of highlighted the powwow and Michigan Indian tuition waiver as things that we have, but things that we can improve, right? The powwow, used to be on campus, and it's not. And there's some areas of growth and healing that could, I think help improve that as well. College Horizons and Grad Horizons is a partnership with, one of the leading advocates for Native, educational attainment in the country. And we've been lucky to have College Horizons on campus a couple of times, most recently about 2 years ago. And that was thanks to Stephanie Riegel's leadership. Stephanie was also part of this task committee. And so grateful for that work. We were going to have Grad Horizons on our campus this summer, but because of COVID, we had to go remote. So it wasn't physically on our campus, but we continue to work very closely with College Horizons and Grad Horizons. And we'd like for them, one of those programs, to be on our campus. They're national programs, but we'd like to have one of them on our campus each summer, right? And so some current efforts, in addition to the current resources, include territorial acknowledgement. We're still working on it. I think we're getting closer to having sort of an institutional territorial acknowledgement. And we're advancing that practice. Smudging, which is super, super important in terms of Native student sense of belonging, and faculty and staff for that matter, to be able to re-engage in spiritual practice, they need to be able to smudge. To be able to bring elders onto campus and do things in a good and respectful way, we need to be able to smudge those spaces before the elders enter them, right? And so again, this goes back to the boarding schools. These are things that were absolutely forbidden and that children were punished for doing. And so we want to be part of that healing process of that historical trauma, and make sure that these things are not just available, but encouraged. Dilip Das, put together a great cross-campus collaborative with a number of institutions of higher ed across our state called See Them, and this addresses directly the invisibility, right? So we need to make the issues of Native students, Native faculty, and staff, and just the Native community in general more visible as we promote higher education and greater educational attainment. College Horizons, Grad Horizons, we already talked about it. Some culturally responsive and fun ways of addressing this. Lacrosse has an important intersection with the history of the state of Michigan. It was played on this land for thousands of years before the Europeans arrived, right? And so even has connections to hockey, which some Native groups referred to as ice lacrosse, right? So even the hockey traditions of this area were derived from Native populations. And so reconnecting Native populations to those traditions and the youth to those sports traditions in a fun way, and at the same time encouraging education. Rackham is trying to partner with tribal schools and colleges in their MSI initiative. LS&A is trying to do the same thing with their transfer program. We have a number of tribal colleges in the state, most of which are 2-year schools, right? So after 2 years, we'd love them to come to the University of Michigan. We're working on an elder in residence program, fingers crossed that this could integrate well with something like the residential college, perhaps. LS&A has the Kessler Scholars Program and also has the UP Scholars Program, and exploring possible donor-funded cohort-based scholarship programs specifically for Natives. A really big, important announcement was that Mellon Foundation just recently funded what is being called right now the RISE Center, Research for Indigenous Social Action and Equity. Stephanie Freiberg is the faculty member and PI for this research center. And part of the vision is making sure that this is a place where Native people are empowered to do research about their own community, but that requires more Native students to receive that training and to do that work. And so this speaks to how OEM can really help build the capacity and build a pipeline so that Native students can really benefit from all this great work that our Native faculty are doing. And then Native American faculty hiring, there's the new anti-racism faculty hiring initiative. And so making sure, again, that Native voices are at the table and the needs of the Native community as a form of, decolonization and anti-racism work, those needs are addressed as well. And so, again, forgive me for going through so quickly, but I wanted to highlight some things that are specifically like in the bailiwick of OEM. So these are some things that you all could help us with. And the next slide I went through some of these, right? So orientation programs, working with the tribal communities around K through 12 interventions, building on even our current structures and just making sure that natives are visible in those, within those structures and have access to participate. I think the single most impactful thing that OEM could do to help increase the enrollment and success. I know that not everything is financially dependent, but when you knock down some of these financial barriers for certain populations, the dream of a University of Michigan education becomes more real. And so there are real limitations to the Michigan Indian tuition waiver. It sounds great. It sounds like, we as a state government are, doing great by our promise and our commitment to Native populations, but actually the restrictions, the legal restrictions and the requirements, the kind of documentation actually make this very, very difficult for students to navigate. So if I'm an Anishinaabe young person and I live in Ohio or Illinois or somewhere else in the diaspora like Oklahoma, I trace my roots back thousands of years to what is now the state of Michigan, and I can't access the Michigan Indian tuition waiver, even though it's meant for my tribal people, right? Another is I might live my entire life in the UP. I could have federal federal enrollment in one of the federal tribes. My ancestors, my immediate parents and grandparents all lived in exactly the same place. We trace our heritage back thousands of years, but for some reason I don't meet or I can't document the blood quantum requirement. I can't access the Michigan Indian tuition waiver, right? Or another thing, enrollment is really tribal dependent and varies from each federal recognized tribe to another. And so maybe I know, or maybe I do qualify and just never enrolled. I know that I'm part of this tribe culturally, linguistically, in terms of my own, family background, but for whatever issue in terms of having to demonstrate documents, I can't get my official enrollment in the tribe. I don't qualify. And so the one thing that I think OEM if there was a conversation internally, is to see what the University of Michigan can do with its tremendous resources to go beyond what the Michigan Indian tuition waiver does as a piece of state legislation, right? So if these are the barriers or these are the obstacles, like we don't have to be hemmed in by what the state of Michigan says. Like there's no limits to our generosity, right? There's no limits to the benefits that we can provide for our own Michigan students or prospective students to help convince them, right, that this is the right place for them. And so thinking about, a Fort Meigs fellowship program or a Fort Meigs scholarship program that doesn't have all of the legal barriers that the Michigan Indian tuition waiver has, and allocating those funds so that more Native students can afford a University of Michigan education. And maybe, as much as we want to center and acknowledge the Anishinaabe, maybe even exploring ways, the University of Michigan thinks of itself as a national university and an international university, even expanding beyond the state of Michigan and the Anishinaabe communities to include within this Fort Meigs scholarship program or Fort Meigs fellowship program, other tribal citizens across the country, so that we can bring Native students from across the country to experience an education at a place like the Rise Center and work with amazing faculty, visionary faculty like Stephanie Freiberg and so many others on our campus. And so with that, I will now really take questions. And thank you for listening to me and bearing with me going through so much so quickly.
All right, so this is Q&A time. Feel free to ask any questions that you might have to Ephraim. And I also wanted to not to forget, because per Stephanie's request, she wanted us to highlight OEM's highlights, what we're doing right now with Native student initiatives. So I'm not sure if they're on the call or not still, but Kelly Cox and or Megan, if you had any highlights you wanted to talk about OEM's efforts in terms of recruiting and retaining Native American students, that would be awesome.
Yeah, this is Kelly. If there's no questions, happy to try to give a quick rundown of some of the different things that we've been doing from OUA and the recruitment side, but also want to make sure if there are, you're happy to send that out, with a summary by email or something that maybe Antonio could pass on to the participants. So apologies to make sure there's nothing else there before we run in to some of the things we've been doing. Well, it was mentioned about the College Horizons program, which is mentioned. Stephanie has been really instrumental in getting the University of Michigan as one of the partner institutions. And so it was 2019 when we did host that program on campus. But going back to 2017, the last 4 summers, we've had members of OUA recruitment staff participate as what they label as faculty, to basically go out and be embedded with the students and the programs at different institutions across the country. Usually there's 2 different sites each summer that are hosting. And so we had Chantel Caven did it, Allison Wang, and Sam mentioned in the chats that at a previous institution, she had a chance to participate. Daniela Guzman, Kyle Manley, Krista Soro, and I know Andrew was scheduled to this summer until they went virtual and things conflicted. So it's, I think, a great way for our staff to besides going through and trying to help mentor and assist the students going through the program, but for our staff to really learn from the experience too, and come back and be better informed and more effective recruiters in that fashion. And so we are hoping to have that as a regular rotation on our campus, but still continue to participate wherever it may be hosted in the future. Also going back, we participated with the Native American Student Association. Typically during the year, sometimes a couple different times of the year, we would partner with them to do some call outs for prospective students or for admitted students, even in the summer, as a bit of a welcoming. And I think as much as we try to go out and be that voice and help speak to students and encourage their enrollment, having prospective students hear from currently enrolled students to more directly hear about their experience, more of that peer-to-peer authentic voice is really important. So we've been trying to maintain that partnership with them and bring them into opportunities to engage with us as we contact prospective students. The Dance for Mother Earth powwow, back when it was hosted on campus, and now that it's off campus, we do some things there, reaching out to admitted students and prospective students who have self-identified in any way as Native American or being from Indigenous communities, and basically invite them to come in to the powwow, sponsoring their tickets for them and their family, providing a free t-shirt when they come in and participate and do that. And so something we do each year to try to help draw people in and see locally what's in place here, but also just to further connect and engage with them. Mentioned the traditional lacrosse, and again, unfortunately with COVID, some things got derailed there. There was big plans to have a game this summer, and we were going to have some students from 4 different tribal communities that were going to be coming in and visiting campus that we were going to have a chance to do some workshops with. That all took place virtually this year. So we were still excited to have that opportunity, but hoping that will be something that we can continue to do in person eventually as well. And then Krista Soro mentioned, who had been faculty part of the College Horizons program. He also participated this past fall, I'm going to say it was late October, and doing a presentation with some of our colleagues from Northwestern and Brown, I think it was. And basically talking about some of the repair work and bridging back, as Ephraim had mentioned, acknowledging the history and the troubles that have existed in the past, but also talking about some of the current things taking place to try to really help put resources in place, provide a sense of community for students, and what we're doing to further that change. So having different sessions like that to try to connect with students is some of the outreach efforts that we all have in place from OUA.
Hi, I'll jump in. I'm Megan Mank. I'm the Assistant Director for Scholarships in the Office of Financial Aid. And I'll just highlight the Michigan Indian tuition waiver a little bit, which is not a OEM initiative, but University of Michigan is a participating school in this state program. The program is specifically run through the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. So eligible students will apply and become certified directly through the state. Currently, as it stands, there's 4 kind of main components to the MITW program. Students need to qualify for admission. They need to document to the state that they are 1/4 or more Native American blood quantum. They need to be members of federally recognized tribes, and they need to be residents of Michigan for no less than 12 consecutive months. As I said, the application and certification process is handled through the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. Once students are certified as eligible, the Department of Civil Rights will notify us, and we will ensure that these students receive appropriate funding. So it applies to not only undergraduate programs, but really essentially any program of study on campus. So undergraduate programs, graduate programs, professional programs, as well as certificate programs. Currently on campus, there's just shy of 50 students total who receive this award. I think 60% of the students, those students are undergrads, 40% are grads. And of the graduate population, about 30% of those are in professional programs. So we do currently have students receiving the waiver in the dental school, in the law school, and in the medical school. Most questions, though, that students have, we do direct to the Department of Civil Rights because they do field all the administration of that. That's all.
All right, thanks a lot, Kelly and Megan. Now, this is the backpack time. It is 3:01. I'm sorry, we went a little bit over time. But if you have any questions or concerns for Ephraim, feel free to ask him now if you have time to stay on the call, or feel free to reach out to him.
Yeah, thank you again, everyone. I really appreciate you inviting me into this space, and I certainly wish you a restful and happy holiday season. Thank you again, all.
I have some thanks pulling in on chat, but thank you so much, Ethan, for being with us today. We really appreciate it. And same to you. I hope you have a wonderful holiday break and get some rest. So thanks for everybody. If there are no further questions, thanks everybody for joining us today. I'll say on behalf of the committee, thank you so much for being here. Please take a look during your spare time when you have some spare time in between the food and white resting up. We do have some links on further knowledge on our Native communities and history and current students and current populations that we've shared out on our DEI, that kind of DEI invite that you all got. So if you have some time, please take a look over that. And Antonio, do you want to say anything further before we sign off?
Hey, miigwech. Thank you all so much for just being here for the community. I really appreciate that. I love this event that we're able to get different voices, different people on a Zoom as well. So I'm going to ask a lot of questions as well. So look out for my email too, Ethan.
Absolutely. And for those that are still on the call, thank you. There are a couple of resources at the end of the slideshow. So when that gets distributed, resources for Native students, but also resources for higher ed practitioners who are working with Native student population. So I made mention of it earlier in my presentation. I think as sort of a place to start, reading something like Beyond the Asterisks is a really good place to start.
Great. And we hope you're available for further consulting, and we're going to have you back. So we'll do some more on this topic.
Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.
Have a good one.